maybe the most important person in my own formation as a young adult into the work of peace and justice in the faith-based tradition, in the Catholic tradition, was a fellow by the name of Tom Cordero. And I think some of y'all might recognize that name. Tom was a campus minister at the University of Miami when I went down to the University of Miami to be an associate, a junior campus minister, so to speak. And Tom blew open my world, sharing with me things like Walter Wink's Engaging the Power series, and Ched Meyer's work around binding the strong man, and so many other things, Bill Wiley Kellerman and the Seasons of Faith and Conscience. And he shared with me about the Faith and Justice retreats and the work that he had done at Stratcom and so much else. And so, in many ways, Tom is like my spiritual father, and I'm really, really happy to be here with him in this land where he is from. So, I'm grateful for Tom and grateful to be here with y'all tonight. I want to start off with a few caveats before I talk. I want to talk to you today, and I want you to know that I'm coming from an awareness in our own country of all that has been happening around the issue of race and racism and racial justice. That part of being a peacemaker today is acknowledging an awareness of white supremacy and genocide and colonialism. And for me as a white peacemaker, that this is part of my history that I have to own and acknowledge. That I am an inheritor of a legacy that has poisoned the roots of this world in which we live today. I come to you as a white man, as a person who's born and raised here in the United States, as a straight man, and I am shaped by all of these privileges. There's an importance to naming our perspective, to owning, for those of us who are white, our own racism, to acknowledging the work that I personally still have to do in that area. And for me, that includes holding my assumptions, my beliefs, even my most deeply held beliefs and experiences with some degree of suspicion because of my privilege and how I've been shaped by it. So I come to you today with a degree of humility, a recognition of all that I don't understand, of all that I haven't experienced, and hopefully with a willingness to listen, to learn from those who move through this world in a way that is vastly different than the way in which I move through it. As Carla said when she was up here as a black woman, her experience is not mine. And part of my own work to do is to try to listen and understand and appreciate and respect that experience. It was Tom Cordero who taught me this first. One white man to another white man, holding ourselves accountable of how it is that race and class and gender skew our understanding of not just ourselves and our world, but also of the very work that we do for peace. I've been doing peace work for 30 years now, and it's been shaped by the fact that I'm a white man, by all of the privileges and entitlements that have been accorded me because of that social location I have as a white man. So what I want to say as a caveat today is that what I offer today is limited, it's partial, it's shaped by things acknowledged and unacknowledged, and that I'm just one voice in a much larger conversation. The second thing that I wanted to share by way of caveats, I'm full of caveats, is I wanted to clear up any confusion about the title of my talk tonight. The revolution will not be evangelized. When I first came up with that title, I thought I was being kind of cute, taking Gil Scott-Heron's spoken word poem from the early 70s, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, and playing upon it like it's a play on words. And there are allusions in Gil Scott-Heron's original poem that they're allusions to what the revolution will not be. And so when I came up with that idea of the revolution will not be evangelized, I had my younger staff members, I had my wife look at me and say, that doesn't make sense. What are you talking about, the revolution? Of course the revolution will be evangelized. What I meant by it is this: not that it won't be evangelized, but that we can rely on, based on where our churches are in the world today, that it often isn't evangelized. That we come from, and I'm speaking from the perspective of as a Catholic, but many of y'all in other denominations and from other faith traditions probably have some of this same experience, unless you're a Quaker, and you guys are great. Our churches have been captured by the spirit of the culture that they are a part of. A white culture, a capitalistic culture, a culture steeped in empire, and we can't trust that our churches will evangelize the revolution that Jesus talks to, the revolution that Jesus speaks of. So that idea for this talk, that title, The Revolution Will Not Be Evangelized, it's levied as a challenge for us to break the silence within our churches on the revolutionary values of Jesus. That's the end of my caveats. I want to start by quoting somebody a whole lot wiser than me. Y'all have heard of Oscar Romero, I'm supposing, many of you. Oscar Romero wrote, or actually preached this in a sermon: a church that does not provoke crisis, a gospel that does not disturb, a word of God that does not rankle, a word of God that does not touch the concrete sin of the society in which it is being proclaimed. What kind of gospel is that? Just nice, pious considerations that bother nobody. That's the way many people would like our preaching or our teaching or our practice of liturgy or the sacraments to be. Those folks in our churches who avoid every thorny subject so as not to bother anyone or cause conflict and difficulty shed no light on the reality in which they live. Let us take this as our starting point tonight, because Jesus calls us to a faith that interrogates the culture in which we live, that unmasks not just the personal sin, but the social sin, and the demonic power of violence and greed and death which underlies that social sin. And Jesus calls us as people of faith to witness to that deeper reality that is rooted in those revolutionary values of justice and peace and love. When Kathleen got in touch with me about doing this, coming and being with y'all tonight, she asked me if I might consider using Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech, A Time to Break the Silence from 1967, as a sort of jumping off point for some of what I might share with y'all tonight. I think that speech, that sermon offers a really good place for us to start. And I want to put a couple things in here right before I get to it, though, is that I read that for the first time like 30 years ago when I was a young man, when I was 21, 22, 23 years old. I'm trying to figure out what my age is now, 54, so 24 years old. And reading it now, as a person who has been steeped in the experience of anti-racism training, who has been formed and shaped by the experiences and the challenge of my sisters and brothers of color, led me to read that with whole new eyes from which I read it when I was a younger man. That speech, that sermon, is fertile ground for us to discuss a revolution of values that gets at that root of the deeper malady which has war, including the war that we are in Ukraine right now, racism, nationalism, sexism, and more as its symptoms. And what I want to do with y'all today is I want to have a conversation between Martin Luther King and another prophet of our own time, somebody who levied a challenge to us at Pax Christi USA in 2021 when we named him the Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace. And that's Father Brian Massengale, an African-American theologian in our church today and a prophet every bit as challenging as Martin Luther King. And I want to play on a conversation between what it is that Brian Massingale offered us when he challenged us at the reception of his award and the words of MLK from 1967. Let's start with MLK. In that sermon, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence, MLK said, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society." It sounds like Catholic worker philosophy. "When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." This is not the first time that MLK talks about those triplets, and he groups them together, identical children of the same demonic power, not one over another, but part of a whole, interwoven. One of the things that initially attracted me to Pax Christi USA was that in doing this work over the last 50 years, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year, is when we look back at 1972 and Pax Christi USA starting, we have been doing all of our work for 50 years from a position of intersectionality. That we were intersectional even before intersectional was a word. We were taking what Martin Luther King said here, and we were being made by people who had their experience as Catholics within the civil rights movement, but also within the farm workers movement, also within the anti-war movement, also within the feminist movement. It was veterans of those movements who looked around and said, we should have a corporate, a communal Catholic voice on these issues to speak from, to draw on the well of Catholic social teaching, to draw on the gospel of Jesus and speak to our own church. That's part of Pax Christi's history. It's this sense of intersectionality. And even though MLK didn't have the language for it in 1967, when he talks about those triplets, it's an invitation for us to approach the work intersectionally. Not to get locked in our silos. Not to get locked into single issues. Not to set up false hierarchies where certain issues are more important or more radical or more whatever than other issues are. These are just false choices that the culture forces us into. And the enemies of peace and justice would have us divided so that they can conquer us, would have us squabbling, internecine, interfamily squabbles about what is most important, rather than recognizing the interconnectedness of this. Whether your entry point is the Black Lives Matter movement or it's immigration, whether your issue is nuclear disarmament or militarism, whether it's human dignity, including LGBTQ issues, these are entry points on a circle that if we go from the surface and we drill down, they connect. And they connect at that same place from which they all flow, which is empire, which is domination. What's important is not the singular issues that we may be involved in, but the broader revolution of values that is the true threat to those triplets that Martin Luther King named and to any of the issues that we speak to in our work for peace and justice. When Brian Massingale came to us in 2021, he said, and he had spoken to us 15 years ago, and he was reminding us of what he told us back in 2008, 2009. Lee, were you there with us in Chicago when Brian talked? Yeah. What he had talked to Pax Christi about back in the late 2000s, he said this: I declared that if Pax Christi USA was to be relevant and on the frontier as a Catholic peacemaking movement with justice, then it had to become even more intersectional in both theory and practice. Peace, I declared, can no longer be a stand-alone issue. The crises that face us, militarism, racism, ecology, poverty, They are interlocking, overlapping, and compounded. Single-issue groups and struggles will be neither effective nor compel people's attention. To paraphrase the great Audre Lorde, many people do not have the luxury of engaging single-issue struggles because we do not live single-issue lives. I know how true this is, especially when we talk about how it is that our work attracts or repels people of new generations, people in their 20s and their 30s and 40s. When Patty originally reached out to me, I think it was because you read an article where I was talking about young adult work, and you said, I'd like you to come and talk about what we can do to invigorate, new generations for this work. And when it is that Brian put this question for me, what I heard echoing was something that I imagine many of you have asked yourself or heard echo within your own movements. It's this question of how do we pass on this legacy to new generations of peacemakers? And one of the keys for that is what MLK was calling us to. It's what Brian is calling us to. Rising generations understand that to be authentic, we have to be intersectional. It can't be just our pet issue. We can't work in a silo. We have to recognize how our issue or issues are connected and how they build on one another and how we need to tackle them together. It's not just a question of being intersectional, it's a question of being intersectional because to be intersectional is to be authentic. I remember this being really driven home to me in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Pax Christi USA was early to the call to defund the police in our country. And when we signed on with some of our partner groups in the Black Lives Matter movement to efforts to defund the police, I heard from some Pax Christi members who were not happy about it. They called me up and they're respectful, I give them that, but they challenged. Why are we talking about defunding the police? And again, this is overwhelmingly white peacemakers in Pax Christi USA. The police can protect us. There are some issues with the police. They're bad apples, but we need police. We need somebody to keep law and order. We don't need to defund the police. And what I realized was the pathway to a conversation with them started with the question, aren't we about defunding the military? All 50 years of Pax Christi USA's history, y'all, we've been working to defund the military. We've got a campaign right now, Bread Not Stones, that's aimed at putting people over the Pentagon and defunding the military. And when I started to talk to some of our folks about how it is that we've talked about defunding the military, I made that connection to defunding the police. That the parallels there in an armed force within our cities and towns that is increasingly militarized is part and parcel. It's on that same spectrum of the defund the military work we have done all along. And more importantly, it's that work that Jesus calls to us to when we talk about within our movement restorative justice. And those of us with eyes to see and ears to hear know that the police look very different depending on what color you are and what part of town you live in. So those intersections between defunding the military and defunding the police. The same conversations happened around our folks who were up in arms about kids being caged at the border. But we're a little hesitant when we started talking about caging black men and women in the mass incarceration system here in the United States. Well, what do you do with people that are violent? Certainly we must have some prison system. There's a conversation to be had there. but our work in being authentic. We recognize the connection and the way that caging brown kids at the border is attached to the policies that lead to the mass incarceration of black men and women in this country as well. Brian went on to challenge us to remain relevant and on the frontier as a Catholic movement of peacemaking with justice. You must be perceived as not only anti-war and pro-nonviolence. You must also make explicit linkages between peacemaking, racism, consumerism, and ecological justice, and you have to be LGBTQ inclusive. This is something in just the 20 years that I have been, 22 years now, that I have been on the staff of Pax Christi USA. This last thing about being LGBTQ inclusive is something that we were always wink, wink, quiet on the side about. Yes, of course we support our LGBTQ folks, but we recognize that as people who stand for the human dignity that is at the heart of the gospel, we need to be loud and proud about LGBTQ inclusivity within Pax Christi USA, and that it is part of those issues that we believe in. In the run-up to the election of 2020, we had a chance as a staff to look at what are the principles that we believe in as a movement. And we put out a statement of principles. You can find it on our website. But this statement of principles was oriented in such a way as to draw not distinct silos around those issues, but to weave those issues together. For us, that revolution of values that MLK talked about flows from this, and this is what we wrote at the beginning of our statement of principles. It flows from our commitment to follow in the footsteps and example of Jesus, the one born to a people suffering oppression, forced to cross borders as a refugee, devoted to supporting the struggles of marginalized peoples, persecuted and violently killed by the ruling empire, and that this guides our discernment of the current signs, plural, of the times. The revolution of values that we seek in the person of Jesus himself is and must be intersectional. It is more comfortable and easier to practice solidarity with people often halfway around the world than it is to practice solidarity with people in our own communities. It's that insight that led, in part, to Pax Christi USA's own commitment to undertake the work of anti-racism during the late 90s. And we were, as far as I know, the first national Catholic organization to come up with a 20-year plan to perpetuate anti-racism analysis throughout our movement. And it's been work that we've been doing for almost 25 years now. And when we talk about anti-racism, and I'm sure that most of y'all are far ahead of this than I am, it's important to make the distinction between racial justice and anti-racism. Because folks in Pax Christi USA, and lots of us who are white peacemakers, have been about racial justice for a long time. That's looking outward. Anti-racism says, let's look inward. Let's talk about how racism has shaped our own organizations. How white supremacy dictated the agenda of the movements that we are part of. Let's name it. Let's own it. Let's dismantle it, and let's reconstruct it. It's about turning that gaze internally. How is it woven? How is white supremacy woven in the very assumptions, beliefs, vocabulary, practice, for instance, even with our understanding of nonviolence? How has it touched and tainted that? And how can we reimagine it? Pax Christi USA's work around anti-racism, I think, has been the most difficult work that we have done, because we're used to getting pushback from people out there on the other side of the picket line, on the other side of the protest. But what happens when those of us, again, and I want to talk especially to our white folks in this room, when we're uncomfortable with the pushback that comes from diagnosing our own racism, from interrogating our own organizations and our own movement. And I remember hearing this from people within Pax Christi USA. Oh, that anti-racism stuff, that's great, but you're watering down our work for nuclear disarmament. You're watering down our work to stem the military budget. It was this idea that anti-racism somehow was an issue that existed alongside the other issues we worked on, rather than understanding that it was a way of reorienting our vision, of seeing something anew. Again, MLK talks about that in his speech when he quotes Arnold Toynbee, and he says that a new consciousness is needed, a new way of seeing. And for people my skin color, for people from my background, this work of anti-racism was about seeing things differently than I had seen them before, within my own identity and the identity of the organizations and movements that I am a part of. I sometimes think that when we hear people like, I've heard a lot about y'all's governor here in Iowa. I lived in Florida for 30 to 35 years, and so I'm familiar with Ron DeSantis. We are really comfortable about giving pushback to Ron DeSantis on wokeness. But that pushback about wokeness that comes from people like DeSantis and Trump, it comes from folks in our own movements as well. From white people in our own movements as well. And that holds us back from being authentically that vision of the beloved community that MLK talked about, and that reign of God that was the proclamation of Jesus. When Brian met with us in 2021, he said that the greatest threat to peace in our time, both nationally and even internationally, is the rise of white nationalism. White nationalism is the existential, visceral conviction that this country, its public spaces, its history, its culture, belong to white people in a way that they do not and should not belong to others. That America was meant to be, and always should remain, a white Christian nation. White nationalism is the gravest threat to peace precisely because it is intersectional, threatening social stability and human flourishing on multiple levels and fronts. And he made that intersectional case. White nationalism is anti-women, right? Toxic masculinity, the controlling of women in our culture. Anti-immigrant, the treatment, how the way that our country treats people who are in brown bodies, who are simply seeking safety and shelter. It's anti-LGBTQ. We see this in the denial of the humanity of people who are trans. And it is an ecological threat. That refusal to accept the irrefutable reality of climate change and so much more. And so what he posed is a challenge to those of us who are white peacemakers, because our friends, our siblings of color who have been doing peace work for a long time, they know the threat that white nationalism has. They see it and they live with it every day. It's not something that they can choose to ignore. But for those of us who are white, this threat of white nationalism should occupy a special place of attention to white faith-based peacemakers. Because one, it shows what happens when white privilege goes unexamined, unacknowledged, unconfronted. It's what happens when we dismiss, minimize, or marginalize white supremacy, not just out there in our culture, but in our own midst, in our own lives, our own organizations. And two, because it's not just white nationalism, it should be a special area of confrontation for us. It's because it's white Christian nationalism. It's the co-opting of Jesus. It's the failure of our churches to witness to the Jesus that stands against everything that white Christian nationalism stands for. In his speech, Beyond Vietnam, in his sermon, MLK talks about a maturity that folks in the United States, that the country, that our government must come to. But I think it's also a maturity that he is asking of white peacemakers in this movement, in the movement that he was a part of in 1967, in the challenge that Brian Massengale puts to us today, that we who are white must have the maturity to enter into spaces that are uncomfortable with humility. That we take Brian's assertion around white nationalism seriously, even if it undermines our own sacred cows. Even if it means that we don't get, as white people, to control the agenda. For those of us who are Catholic, if y'all haven't heard the news, as of a few years ago, those of us who are white, our Catholic Church in the United States is a minority church now. There are more people of color in the U.S. Catholic Church than there are white people. And what Pax Christi USA recognized when we started this work around anti-racism in the late 90s was that if we were going to be accountable to people of color within our own movement, as well as those outside of it, then it meant that we needed to center the experience of our brothers and sisters of color within the peacemaking world, resetting our agenda because of their experience, letting their voices lead. For us as Pax Christi, this has meant taking that call that Brian put before us seriously, to confront white nationalism, that it is the gravest threat to peace. MLK said that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is our own government. What Brian would say is it's because its underlying philosophy, its underlying strategy is the strategy of white Christian nationalism. So what is necessary for this revolution of values, maturity, humility, willingness to turn the light inward as well as outward? For white people, it means confronting the white privilege that shields us from taking the full measure of things like white nationalism. It means doing this work precisely because it hits so close to home. Those of us who are Catholic workers and have been brought up in the Catholic worker movement are fond of quoting Dorothy Day about afflicting the comfortable, or comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Sometimes we, white peacemakers, are the comfortable, and we need some of that affliction. In conclusion, MLK asks during his sermon, why are we afraid? Why are we silent? And we're lucky in Pax Christi USA to have a bishop president who isn't afraid to be prophetic within the institutional church. Bishop John Stowe, Franciscan from the Diocese of Lexington, Kentucky. And at our closing 50th anniversary conference back in August, Bishop Stowe put a few things before us that I thought would serve well as a closing. He said, as a church, it does not seem that we were sufficiently vigilant about those who were being excluded, about promoting the nonviolence of Christ, about challenging oppression wherever it was, about promoting equality and equal dignity among all our members. We seem to be part of an institution living in fear, not heeding that most frequent admonition of Jesus to be not afraid. And he speaks there of this accommodation about the revolution will not be evangelized because of the accommodation of our church with the culture that is in and of itself anti-gospel. He says he sees those inconsistencies, that we see those inconsistencies when we see it when Catholics are promoting the death penalty and awarded for doing so. When Catholics are eager for vengeance and retaliation. Again, I'm speaking to Catholics, but y'all broaden that, Catholics, make it a little C. When we are willing to bless armaments, but not some couples. When the voices of women are not being heard in the fights about abortion within our church. When the institution cannot bring itself to say, Black Lives Matter. And when the self-proclaimed uber Catholics insist that they know more or better than the Pope. When I got this position as executive director of Pax Christi 3.5 years ago, I got a call from Mary Lou Kanaki, who's a former national coordinator of Pax Christi. She's one of our teachers of peace. She just passed away on January 6th. And the first thing that I did was I reached out to a lot of people that I admire, and I said, what do I got to know to do this right? You know, what do I need to know to honor the legacy of Sister Patty Chappelle and Mary Evelyn Jagan and Dave Robinson and Joe Clark and all these different people that Bishop Tom Gumbleton, Tom was one of the people I called. You know, what do I need to know? And Mary Lou's answer was really succinct. She said to me, keep your eyes on the Pope. Keep your eyes on this Pope. Because this Pope is inviting us to be bold again, to take chances. Bishop Stowe said he's inviting us, he's expressing his preference for a church that is hurting and bruised because it is out in the streets rather than suffocating from being confined. Bishop Stowe asked, how many of our heroes in this work of faith-based peacemaking and justice-seeking have known what it means to be hurt and bruised in speaking out, in taking action? And that brings us back to MLK, who started his speech by talking about breaking the silence. By breaking the silence to speak to embody, to witness that revolution of values. And his last words to us are, some of us, the Carla Dawsons, other people in this room, have already begun to break the silence of the night, that have found that the call to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision. But we must speak. Amen, brothers and sisters?
Amen.
Amen. All right, folks.